4 kilometers beneath an ice moon that appears on no star chart worth trusting, something has been breathing for 300 years. Not sleeping, not dead. Breathing, slow, patient, deliberate, like a soldier lying perfectly still in the dark, waiting for the one sound that tells them it's finally time to move. Nobody was supposed to find it. That was the entire point. It was buried so deep, so precisely, so far beneath a world nobody cared about, that an entire alien empire built its capital city directly on top of a secret that could unravel everything it believed about itself, and never once knew it was standing on a loaded weapon that had chosen, for 3 centuries, not to go off. Until one tired, nervous survey technician refused to let a sensor reading go. Until a drill broke through into air that shouldn't exist. Until a door that had not opened in 300 years decided, all on its own, that the moment had finally come. What was sealed down there wasn't a relic. It wasn't a grave. It was a promise, one written in steel and silence by people the galaxy had been told, for 300 years, no longer existed. And when that promise finally woke up, it didn't ask for revenge. It asked one single, devastating question that would bring an empire to its knees before it even understood why. Stay with me, because what happens next didn't just change one moon or one throne world. It cracked open the biggest lie a civilization ever told itself. And by the end, you'll understand exactly why some lines get held even when no one is watching, and why some soldiers never really stop fighting a war everyone else assumes is over. The ice moon of Cassandra had no name in any language spoken by a living species. It orbited a dead gas giant on the far edge of the Threll Compact, a place so cold and so forgotten that even the mapping drones stopped bothering to update its charts a century ago. Nothing lived there. Nothing was supposed to be there at all. That was exactly why survey technician Kiever Thess almost didn't report the anomaly. He was 26 years old, 3 months into his first deep survey contract, and desperately trying not to be the junior tech who cried wolf over a sensor glitch. His supervisor, a weathered Threll named Dorun who had spent 30 years cataloging rocks nobody cared about, had already warned him twice that week about overflagging noise as signal. So when the gravimetric scanner returned a reading that made no sense 4 kilometers beneath the ice, Kiever sat very still for a long moment and told himself it was probably nothing. It was not nothing. The reading sat there on his display, patient and impossible. A cavity beneath the ice, symmetrical in a way glaciers never were, with walls that curved with mathematical precision instead of the chaotic fracture patterns of natural ice formation. He ran the scan 4 more times. He recalibrated the array twice. The anomaly did not waver, did not blur, did not do any of the things a sensor error was supposed to do when you pressed it hard enough. It sat there, silent and geometric, radiating a wrongness that made the hair on Kiever's arms rise, even though the survey pod was climate-controlled to a comfortable 22 degrees. He requested a core sample. Dorun said no. The survey had a schedule, a budget, and absolutely no patience for a rookie chasing shadows under a moon nobody had ever cared about. But Kiever had learned one useful thing in his short career, which was that persistence dressed up as professionalism tended to outlast a supervisor's irritation. He didn't argue. He simply kept the anomaly flagged, kept rerunning the scan every few hours, and kept quietly building a file of data that grew harder and harder to dismiss as noise. 3 days later, the Compact's Deep Survey Authority sent an automated flag of its own, an algorithm somewhere in a distant server farm having independently noticed the same geometric impossibility and kicked it up the chain without any human or Threll involvement at all. That was the thing that finally got Dorun's attention. Machines didn't get nervous. Machines didn't chase reputations. When an unbiased system flagged the same anomaly, a green tech had been quietly obsessing over. Even a 30-year veteran started paying attention. The core sample authorization came through within 6 hours. The drill went down through 4 kilometers of ice in a slow, grinding descent that took the better part of a full rotation. Keever stood at the surface console the entire time, watching the depth counter climb in increments that felt both agonizingly slow and terrifyingly fast, and telling himself over and over that this was probably just a pocket of ancient volcanic gas, a fluke of subsurface chemistry, nothing more. He almost believed it. He almost managed to convince himself right up, until the moment the drill bit broke through into open space at 4,011 meters, and the pressure sensors spiked, held, and stabilized in a pattern that matched breathable atmosphere. Not vacuum, not trapped ancient gas venting into nothing. Atmosphere, filtered, recycled, and, according to every instrument reading that came back up the shaft, still actively being maintained. The lab technicians who processed the air sample went very quiet when they saw the composition. It wasn't Threll-breathable in the optimal sense, though it wouldn't kill one either. It was calibrated for something else entirely, something with a slightly higher oxygen tolerance and a narrower humidity range. Something that used to be extinct, according to every history book the Threll Compact had ever printed. By the following morning, the survey site had a military perimeter around it, and by evening, a proper excavation shaft was being cut, wide enough for a full team, wide enough for equipment that made it very clear this had stopped being an archaeological curiosity and become something the Compact's highest authorities wanted eyes on personally. Keever was allowed to go down with the first team. Nobody explicitly forbade it, and in the chaos of the escalation, nobody remembered too. He would spend the rest of his life torn between gratitude and regret over that oversight. The elevator cage rattled down through raw ice and stone for what felt like an eternity, the walls shifting color and texture as natural rock gave way to something smoother, darker, and unmistakably manufactured. Keever felt it before he saw it, a change in the air pressure, a low hum beneath the mechanical groan of the elevator cage, the particular quality of silence that machinery makes when it has been running so long it has simply become part of the ambient world around it. Then the floodlights caught the tunnel wall, and the natural ice simply stopped, replaced by a smooth, dark alloy unlike anything in the Compact's material catalogs. "That's not Threll metallurgy," muttered Sergeant Alina Marsh, one of the 2 military engineers assigned to escort the survey team down. He ran a gloved hand along the seam where stone met alloy, a boundary so clean it looked deliberate rather than geological. "That's not anyone's alloy I recognize, and I've cataloged wreckage from 6 different species." The elevator finally stopped at a landing carved directly into the shaft wall. Beyond it, a corridor stretched away into darkness, its walls lined with paneling that still, impossibly, carried a faint residual electrical charge. Emergency lighting strips flickered weakly to life as the team's motion tripped ancient sensors, a slow cascade of dim amber light awakening deeper into the mountain one segment at a time, like something rousing itself from a very long sleep. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then Prahl said the thing everyone was already thinking. "Something down here still has power." They advanced in a tight formation, weapons raised more out of reflex than any real expectation of a target, boots echoing on a floor that hadn't felt the weight of a living creature in centuries. The corridor opened after 200 meters onto a set of blast doors, actual blast doors, thick as a person is tall, stamped with an emblem that made Keever's breath catch even before he understood what he was looking at. A stylized eagle, wings spread wide, gripping something in its talons, ringed by a scattering of stars. "Translate it," someone said into the silence. "There's nothing to translate," Keever replied, staring at the symbol. "It's not language, it's a flag." The doors did not respond to their equipment. Explosive charges scorched the surface and did nothing else. A second attempt was called off entirely when Prahl pointed out, correctly, that whatever was still generating the low hum behind those doors might not appreciate being detonated at from the outside. It was a young systems analyst named Farah Nyes who finally cracked it, running a passive diagnostic scanner along the door's seam and picking up the faint, degraded but still functioning signature of a proximity sensor. The doors weren't locked in any conventional sense. They were waiting for something the scanner's passive signature apparently satisfied, because with a shriek of ancient hydraulics and metal that hadn't moved in 3 centuries, the massive blast doors began slowly to part. What lay beyond stole the breath out of every single person standing in that tunnel. A hangar, vast beyond anything the initial survey had predicted, carved and reinforced deep beneath a moon nobody had ever thought worth a second glance. Lit now by dim amber emergency strips that revealed, section by section, the outline of something massive resting inside a cradle of scaffolding and support struts. A warship. Not Threll in design, not Threll in scale either. Long, angular, brutally functional in its lack of ornamentation, built by people who had clearly cared far more about survival than elegance. Its hull, streaked with 3 centuries of settled dust, still bore markings, alphanumeric strings, hazard labels, and along its flank, in letters taller than a person, a name none of them could read. Keever walked toward it as though moving through a dream, his footsteps the only sound in a hangar that had been silent since before the Compact's oldest recorded treaties were signed. "Sir," Farah said quietly, staring at her scanner, her voice tight with something between awe and dread. "This vessel isn't derelict. Power signature is low, but it's active. It's been active this entire time." Within 2 days, the Discovery had stopped belonging to the survey team entirely. Military intelligence arrived first, then the Compact's historical synod, then a rotating procession of officials whose titles grew longer and whose patience grew shorter with every passing hour. Keever, technically still the discoverer of record, was quietly demoted from participant to observer, tolerated mostly because he understood the site's structural history better than anyone else who had bothered to show up. He watched from the edges of a hangar that now buzzed with generators and floodlights as the Compact's best linguists fed the ship's hull markings into translation engines built, with no small irony, using fragments recovered from the Compact's oldest sacred texts, the ones describing the Great Reckoning, the war that had supposedly ended, according to every history Keever had ever been taught, in the total extinction of humanity. The first full translation came back on the 3rd day, and it landed in the command tent like an unexploded bomb. TFS Watchkeeper, Fleet Registry 441, commissioned during the 3rd expansion era. The 3rd expansion era. The exact same era the Compact's founding texts described as the height of the war against the human enemy. A war the Threll had, according to every account taught in every schoolroom on every Threll world, decisively and completely won. "This is a forgery," declared High Archivist Meneth Saul, an elderly Threll whose entire career had been built on preserving that founding narrative. "Or a trophy, a captured vessel brought here after our victory and stored for study." It was a reasonable theory. It was also, as the survey teams continued mapping the hangar, becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. Captured trophies did not come equipped with functioning life support. Captured trophies were not hidden at extraordinary engineering, cost 4 kilometers beneath an otherwise worthless moon by someone who apparently wanted it buried and forgotten rather than displayed. Every new survey found more evidence pointing in the same uncomfortable direction. This ship had not been placed here as a prize. It had been placed here deliberately, before anyone had thought this moon worth a second glance, by someone who wanted it hidden, protected, and left completely alone. Ask yourself, Keever offered quietly during one of the rare moments anyone bothered to solicit his opinion. Why bury a trophy where no one is ever meant to find it? You display trophies. You don't dig a shaft into an ice moon and forget about it for 300 years. Archivist Saul did not appreciate the observation. She also had no counter for it. The unease deepened when survey teams reached the ship's lower decks and found the data core fully intact, its housing built from a material the compact's engineers couldn't identify, let alone breach. Deeper still, past corridors lined with equipment whose purpose nobody could determine. They found a chamber that made even the accompanying soldiers go quiet. A single stasis pod, softly humming, its internal display cycling through slow, steady biological readings. Someone was alive in there, had been alive in some suspended fashion for 300 years. The report reached the compact's ruling council within the hour. What came back within a day was not caution. It was curiosity wearing the mask of command. Revive it, bring the relic before the council. Archivist Saul argued against the order with every ounce of institutional weight the Synod's protocols allowed. Whatever the compact's histories claimed about the war's end, she said, no one currently living had actually witnessed it, and no one currently understood what exactly they'd be waking up. A dead man's switch. A weapon. A message meant for someone the Threll Compact could not identify. The Council's answer, relayed through an aide with visible discomfort, was short. The Compact is not afraid of the ghosts of a war it already won. Keever, watching that order come down, found himself staring at the eagle emblem on the blast doors, at the stars scattered around it like a promise. He did not know yet what that promise was, but standing in that hangar, feeling the ship's quiet hum beneath his boots like a held breath, he was suddenly deeply certain of one thing. Whatever the Compact believe, it had won, it had not won everything. That night, after the Council's order came down, Keever could not sleep. He lay in his bunk in the temporary housing module bolted to the surface above the excavation, listening to the wind scrape across the ice outside, and found himself running the same thought over and over, the way you press your tongue against a sore tooth even though you know it will hurt. Something buried that deep, that deliberately, guarded by a species everyone believed extinct, was never going to be simple. He had grown up on the stories, the same as every other Threll child, the Great Reckoning, the final battle at the edge of human space, the total righteous victory that had given the Compact its place among the stars. He had never once questioned it, because there had never been a single reason to. Now there was a hangar full of reasons, sitting 4 kilometers beneath his boots, humming quietly in the dark like it was waiting for something he couldn't name. He wasn't the only one awake. Sergeant Prawl found him in the mess module a few hours before dawn, staring into a cup of something that had gone cold an hour earlier. "You should get some rest," Prawl said, not unkindly, dropping into the seat across from him. "Tomorrow's going to be worse than today." "How do you figure?" Prawl was quiet for a moment, turning his own cup slowly between his hands. "Because today we found a ship. Tomorrow we wake up whatever's inside it." He looked up, and for the first time since Keever had met him, the sergeant's usual professional calm had a crack running through it. 20 years I've served this compact. Cleared derelicts, disarmed old ordnance, walked into more than one site that should have killed me. Never once felt what I felt standing in that hangar. He shook his head. That ship isn't dead tech, kid. It's holding its breath. The revival chamber was sealed off from the rest of the excavation, ringed by 3 layers of security, and a medical team assembled from the compact's finest xenobiologists, none of whom had ever treated a living human patient, because as far as any of them had been taught, there hadn't been a living human patient to treat in 300 years. Keever was not supposed to be there. He talked his way in anyway, citing his discovery rights, his structural expertise, anything official sounding enough to survive a guard's cursory glance. Nobody stopped him. He suspected, deep down, that nobody quite wanted to be alone with what was about to happen. The stasis pod's readouts had stabilized days earlier into a slow, steady rhythm. A heartbeat, unmistakably, though sluggish and strange, like a machine idling rather than a body resting. The lead xenobiologist, a nervous thrall named Pharaoh Ithan, spent 6 hours reviewing every scrap of translated documentation before finally, with the council's representatives watching from behind reinforced glass, initiating the revival sequence. The pod hissed open in a slow exhale of preserved atmosphere 3 centuries old, releasing into a room built for a species that had never once smelled it before. Frost curled off the pod's interior. Inside, wrapped in a webbing of medical restraints and support tubing that had somehow kept a body alive and functional for longer than the entire recorded history of the Thrall Compact, lay a human. Small by Thrall standards, unremarkable almost if you didn't know what she represented. Dark-haired, weathered even in stasis, with the particular kind of stillness that belonged to someone who had trained her entire life to stay calm in circumstances designed to make anyone else scream. A name, stitched faintly onto a fragment of uniform the scanners eventually deciphered. Sergeant Alina Marsh. The revival took 4 hours. Vitals fluctuated in ways that terrified the medical team and meant absolutely nothing to them diagnostically. There was no baseline, no precedent, nothing but guesswork dressed up as protocol. Twice, Pharaoh Ithan was certain they'd lost her. Twice, the steady mechanical heartbeat found its rhythm again anyway, stubborn in a way that unsettled everyone watching. And then, in the smallest hours of the following morning, Sergeant Alina Marsh opened her eyes. She didn't scream. She didn't thrash against the restraints, though her physical readings spiked instantly into what the medical team assumed was panic. Instead, she lay very still, her eyes moving methodically across the ceiling, the equipment, the unfamiliar faces staring back at her through glass and masks, cataloging everything with the flat, controlled attention of someone running a threat assessment rather than experiencing a miracle. It took nearly a minute before she spoke. Her voice, translated in real time by systems working overtime to parse a language extinct for 300 years, came out rough, cracked, and utterly steady. How long? Pharaoh Ithan, hands shaking, gave her the number. 311. Venier's standard compact reckoning. Something moved behind Marsh's eyes. Not the shock everyone expected, not grief, not confusion. Something colder and more deliberate, like a mind recalculating an equation it had always known might eventually take this long to solve. She asked one more question, and it was the question that would echo through every account of that morning for years afterward, repeated in whispers among the guards, in reports that eventually reached the highest levels of the Compact's government, in Keever's own memory for the rest of his life. She didn't ask where she was. She didn't ask what had happened to her people. She looked past the glass, past the masks, past 300 years of Threll history built entirely on the certainty of total victory, and asked, in a voice with no fear in it whatsoever, "Did we win?" Nobody in that room had an answer. And in the silence that followed, Keever understood, with a certainty that settled into his bones like cold water, that the question itself was the answer to something the Compact had never once thought to ask. They kept her in a sealed medical wing for 6 days before anyone with real authority spoke to her directly. In that time, Sergeant Alina Marsh did something that unsettled her captors more than any escape attempt could have. She waited. She ate what she was given, submitted to scans she clearly recognized as tests of her biology and her intentions alike, and watched everyone who came near her with the patient, unhurried attention of someone who had, by her own admission on the second day, done considerably longer stretches than this without much to occupy her time. It was Keever, oddly, who she spoke to most freely, not because he held any authority, but because he held none. He'd been granted limited access as the excavation's discoverer of record, tasked with logging observations for the historical archive, and Marsh seemed to find something almost restful in talking to a person who wasn't actively trying to extract a confession or a strategic advantage from her. "You're the one who found the ship," she said on the 4th day, watching him set up a recording device with hands that still shook slightly from nerves he hadn't quite managed to shed. "Lucky me," Keever agreed, unsure if she meant it kindly. She studied him with the same flat, assessing look she'd given everyone since waking. "You people really believe you won." It wasn't a question. Keever chose his words carefully, aware that every syllable of this conversation was being recorded, transcribed, and almost certainly reviewed by people far above his rank within the hour. "Our histories say the war ended when humanity was destroyed. Total victory for the Compact." Marsh was quiet for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, she laughed, a short, humorless sound that carried no warmth at all, but also, strangely, no despair. 300 years, she said, mostly to herself, and you built a whole civilization on that story. On the 7th day, the interrogations began in earnest. Council officials, military intelligence, 3 separate factions of the Compact's leadership, all attempting with varying degrees of subtlety to extract from her a full accounting of a war none of them had actually lived through. Marsh answered some questions fully. Others she deflected with a soldier's practiced vagueness. A few she simply refused to answer at all, staring back at her interrogators in silence until they moved on to something else. But certain things she let slip, not carelessly. Keever was certain, watching from the observation gallery, but deliberately, like a woman placing stones one at a time on a scale only she could see the true balance of. She confirmed the ship's name and registry. She confirmed her rank, her unit, and the approximate date, by human reckoning, that she'd entered stasis. And when High Archivist Saul finally asked the question every session had been circling for a week, whether the Compact's founding history of total human extinction was, in fact, true, Marsh looked at her for a long moment before answering. "You're standing on top of a warship that's still running life support for a crew of 1, she said. "Ask yourself why a defeated, extinct species would leave that running for 300 years instead of just letting me die." Saul had no answer for that either. Nobody did. There was, in the middle of that week, an incident nobody put in the official record until years later, when the Office of Interspecies Historical Review finally declassified the excavation's security logs. A junior member of Delegate Corps' staff, a technician with clearance he should never have been trusted with, attempted to access the Watchkeeper's data core in the dead hours before shift change, carrying with him a portable charge small enough to fit inside a tool case and powerful enough, according to the after-action assessment, to have collapsed the entire lower hangar. H. His stated intention, recovered later from a message he'd drafted but never sent, was simple and, in its own bleak way, understandable: destroy the evidence before it destroyed the story the compact had built itself upon, and let the mystery of the buried ship remain exactly that. A mystery rather than an indictment. He got as far as the outer corridor before the ship's own systems responded. Not with weapons, not with any of the violence the traditionalist faction had spent weeks insisting was coiled somewhere inside that hull. The corridor lighting simply shifted from its dim amber emergency glow to a hard, focused white, every door along the technician's route sealing itself in sequence just ahead of him, herding him gently but unmistakably back toward the excavation's security checkpoint, until a very confused patrol found him standing alone in a dead-end passage, charge still packed in its case, with absolutely no memory of choosing to walk in that direction. It didn't fight him, Farah Nyes reported the next morning, still visibly shaken as she reviewed the corridor's internal sensor logs. It didn't even threaten him, it just redirected him, like something walking a lost child back to the front gate. Keever thought about that report for a long time afterward. A weapon built for war, 3 centuries dormant, waking just enough to disarm a saboteur without ever raising its voice. It was, he decided, the most unsettling thing he had learned in the entire excavation, more unsettling even than the hangar itself, because it meant whatever slept inside that ship had never once needed violence to win. It had simply been patient enough not to require it. It was that night, according to logs later studied obsessively by historians on both sides of what would come next, that the buried ship systems, dormant since the moment they were sealed, tracked by monitoring equipment as nothing more than a low, steady background hum, began very quietly to change. Not dramatically, not with alarms or warning lights, just a slow uptick in power distribution across systems that had sat idle for 3 centuries, as if something deep in the ship's architecture had recognized, at long last, the presence of the one signature it had been waiting this entire time to answer to. The first sign came from Farah Nyes, the systems analyst, 3 weeks into the excavation, hunched over a diagnostic terminal at 2 in the morning when she should have been asleep. Power curves climbing, she told the night shift supervisor, pointing at a readout that had been flatlined at a near-dormant baseline since the hangar was first opened. Slowly, not enough to trip any single alarm, but it's been climbing for 6 days straight. Nobody thought much of it at first. Ancient technology behaving unpredictably wasn't exactly a surprise. But by the following week, sections of the ship that had been catalogued as inert corridors, storage bays, an entire deck previously listed as power-depleted and non-functional, were registering active current again. Doors that hadn't moved in 300 years began, one by one, unsealing themselves. The compact's engineers ran every diagnostic they had. None of them could explain it, until someone finally cross-referenced the timeline against something far simpler than any of their instruments. The ship's dormant systems had begun reactivating almost exactly when Sergeant Marsh was revived. "It's tied to her," Pharaoh Ithan said, staring at the correlation with the particular horror of a scientist watching a hypothesis confirm itself in the worst possible way. "The whole vessel, it's been waiting for her biometric signature, and now that she's active, it's waking up around her." The implications rippled through the command structure fast enough to reach the highest levels of the Compact's council within hours. A hidden warship, buried directly beneath the throne world of the Compact's founding history, quietly powering back to life in response to a single revived human. To the more paranoid factions of Threll leadership, it read exactly like what it appeared to be. A weapon coiled and waiting for 300 years, finally arming itself. Marsh, when questioned about it, didn't deny the correlation. She also, notably, didn't seem alarmed by it. "It's not a weapon," she told her interrogators when pressed for the fourth time in as many hours. "Not the way you're thinking. It's a contingency system. It was built to do exactly one thing, and it's doing it right now whether any of us like it or not." "What thing?" Saul demanded, her patience for diplomatic phrasing long since exhausted. Marsh considered the question for a long moment, long enough that Keever, watching from the gallery, understood she was deciding again how many stones to place on the scale. "You built your whole civilization on the idea that you won a war of extermination," she said finally. "That you wiped us out completely, down to the laws. T-Colony, the last ship, the last person. That's the story you tell your children. That's the story on your monuments." She looked directly at the observation glass as if she could see straight through it to every Threll official watching. "It's not true. We didn't lose. We left." The word landed in the room like a physical blow. "Left," Saul repeated, disbelieving. "We had you," Marsh said, quiet and utterly certain. "At the end, we had the capability to finish it completely, permanently, the way you think you finished us. And somewhere along the way, enough people in my chain of command decided that winning a war by wiping out an entire species wasn't a victory. It was just a different kind of extinction, and we weren't willing to be the ones who caused it." She paused. "So we pulled back, sealed our fleets, went dark, let you have your victory, your monuments, your 300 years of empire because it cost us nothing to let you believe it, and it meant we didn't have to become something we couldn't live with." The chamber was utterly silent. "This ship," Marsh continued, "isn't here to fight you. It never was. It's here because somebody 300 years ago decided that if it ever needed to wake up again, it should do it standing directly underneath the people who thought they'd won." The compact did not fracture all at once. It fractured the way old, load-bearing stone fractures, quietly at first, in hairline cracks nobody wants to acknowledge, until the whole structure is compromised and everyone is left arguing about whose fault the collapse is. Keever learned, faster than he would have liked, that discovering an inconvenient truth did not make a person popular. 2 nights after Marsh first spoke the words, "We didn't lose, we left," in front of the assembled council, Keever was stopped in a transit corridor near the excavation's surface housing by 3 men he didn't recognize, wearing civilian clothes that did nothing to disguise the military bearing underneath. They didn't touch him. They didn't need to. The eldest of the 3, a heavy-set Threll with a traditionalist pin fastened prominently to his collar, simply stood close enough that Keever had to tilt his head back to meet his eyes. "You found the hole in the ice," the man said, his voice pleasant in a way that made the words underneath it land harder. "Nobody's going to forget that. Question is whether history remembers you as the man who discovered something important or the man who helped burn down everything the compact built." He let that sit for a moment, watching Keever's face carefully. "Some things are better left buried, technician. Ice moons keep secrets for a reason." Keever didn't answer. His mouth had gone dry, and his hands, tucked into his jacket pockets, had curled into fists he hoped weren't visible. It was Sergeant Prawl, appearing from a side corridor with the particular unhurried timing of a man who had clearly been listening for longer than he'd let on, who finally broke the standoff. "Gentlemen," Prawl said, his tone light, almost conversational, though his hand rested with obvious deliberateness on the sidearm at his hip. This corridor's under excavation security. I'd hate to have to log an incident report on a slow week." The three men left without another word. Keever didn't sleep that night either. But he also didn't stop showing up to the excavation the next morning or the morning after that. And when he finally admitted the encounter to Marsh during one of their recorded sessions, she was quiet for a long moment before responding. "That's the cost nobody warns you about," she said. "Telling the truth doesn't make people grateful. Sometimes it just makes you the easiest target left standing." She studied him with an expression he hadn't seen from her before, something almost protective. "You scared?" "A little," he admitted. "Good," Marsh said. "Means you understand what's actually happening here. Just don't let it stop you from showing up." He didn't. Word of Marsh's claims spread through the upper echelons of Threll leadership within days, despite every attempt at containment. It reached the council, then the military command, then inevitably, because secrets of this size do not survive contact with a bureaucracy this large, the wider public, in fragments and rumors that grew wilder with each retelling. The reaction split the compact into factions that had, until 3 weeks ago, been unified by a founding myth none of them had ever thought to question. The traditionalists, led by aging members of the council like Delegate Asa Kor, insisted the humans' claims were manipulation. A captured enemy combatant, isolated and desperate, spinning a story designed to demoralize her captors and destabilize an empire she had every reason to want destroyed. They pushed with increasing urgency for the ship to be dismantled, its data core seized, and Marsh either contained indefinitely or quietly eliminated before her. Story could take further root. The Reformists, a smaller but rapidly growing faction among younger officials and military officers, argued the opposite, that the ship's 300-year vigil, its precise burial beneath the throne world itself, and the sheer scale of engineering required to maintain a functioning warship in total secrecy, for that long made Marsh's account far more plausible than the alternative. A defeated, exterminated enemy did not leave behind monuments to their own mercy. Only a victor confident enough to walk away could afford that kind of patience. And a third faction, smaller still but growing louder by the day, approached the revelation with something closer to religious upheaval. If the Compact's founding victory was, in truth, an act of restraint by an enemy who could have annihilated them and chose not to, then everything built atop that myth, the monuments, the doctrines, the entire architecture of Threll's superiority, was standing on a lie the Compact had told itself for 300 years. The Council, caught between these factions and increasingly aware that the situation beneath the throne world had grown far larger than anyone anticipated, convened an emergency session. Marsh was brought before it, not as a prisoner paraded for spectacle, but, for the first time since her revival, as something closer to a diplomat. She stood before the assembled leadership of an empire built on her species' supposed extinction, and she said very little. She didn't need to argue her case. The ship beneath their feet, humming now with power it hadn't held in 3 centuries, was argument enough. "You have a choice in front of you," she told the council, her voice steady in a chamber full of people who, until 3 weeks ago, had never imagined a human voice at all. "You can keep telling the story you've always told and hope nobody outside this room ever finds out it isn't true. Or you can start asking what kind of civilization you actually want to be, now that you know the one you thought you'd built was resting on someone else's mercy." Keever, standing at the edge of the chamber in a role he still couldn't quite believe he'd earned, watched the council's faces during that silence and thought he saw, for just a moment, something that looked less like anger and more like grief. The particular grief of realizing the ground beneath an entire people's identity had been hollow the whole time. It was in that same silence, unnoticed by nearly everyone in the room except Farah Nyes, monitoring systems from a terminal in the corner, that Marsh's hand moved, slight, deliberate, almost invisible, toward a data interface she had insisted on wearing since her revival, disguised as medical monitoring equipment nobody had thought to question. Far below the throne world, in a hangar buried deeper than any Threll structure had ever been built, the Watchkeeper began, at last, to do the one thing it had been waiting 300 years to do. It reached out. Nobody in the compact understood what was happening until it was already far too late to stop. The power surge registered first, a spike so sudden and so massive that half the monitoring equipment in the excavation site simply failed. Overloaded by output the Watchkeeper shouldn't have been capable of generating after 3 centuries of dormancy. Then came the sound, a low, building resonance that traveled up through 4 kilometers of ice and rock, and into the foundations of the throne world itself, felt by every Threll standing in the council chamber as a vibration in their bones before anyone identified its source. Military command scrambled. Orders went out to seal the excavation shaft, to cut power to the site, to do anything at all to contain whatever was happening beneath the capital. None of it worked. The ship's systems, once merely reactivating, were now operating at a scale and sophistication no Threll engineer could interrupt, let alone comprehend. In the council chamber, as alarms began sounding across the throne world, Marsh remained perfectly still, watching the guards level weapons at her with an expression that held no fear at all. "It's not an attack," she said, loud enough to cut through the rising panic. "Stand down. Nothing on that ship is designed to fire on you." "Then what is it doing?" the head of the council demanded, the first words the Threll leadership had spoken directly to her since the interrogations began. "Exactly what it was built to do." Marsh met the council leader's eyes without flinching. "It's telling my people where I am, what I found, what this empire became while it thought no one was watching." Far above the planet, in the dark between the stars, something that had been silent and patient for 300 years finally received the signal it had been waiting for. The compact's outer sensor arrays picked it up within the hour. Not a fleet, not yet, but something worse in its own way. A single vast presence, merging from the deep dark beyond the throne system, broadcasting nothing, demanding nothing, simply arriving exactly the way the buried warship beneath the capital had waited, exactly the way Marsh herself had waited through her decade-spanning sleep. Patient, unhurried, absolutely certain of its welcome. Panic swept the capital. Fleet commanders demanded immediate mobilization. The traditionalist faction called for Marsh's execution, insisting even now that decisive violence could somehow undo what had already been set into motion. The council leader, standing at the center of a chamber falling into chaos, looked instead to the one person who had remained perfectly calm through all of it. "Call off your fleet," the council leader said, and there was no command left in the words, only something that sounded, for the first time, like a request. Marsh shook her head slowly. "It's not a war fleet. It never was." She looked toward the ceiling, toward the sky beyond it, toward whatever vast and patient thing was now settling into orbit above a world that had spent 300 years believing itself unwatched. "You've been telling yourselves a story about a war you won. My people have been telling themselves a much harder story, about a war they chose not to finish, and a promise they made to come back one day and see what you did with the mercy you didn't know you'd been given." She let that settle over the chamber, over the council, over Kiever standing frozen at the edge of it all, over an entire empire built atop a myth that had just cracked open beneath its own throne room. "Today's the day you find out," Marsh said quietly, "whether that promise was worth keeping." Outside, in the pale light falling across the spires of the capital, the sky above the throne world had begun, very slowly, to change. Not with fire, not with fleets of conquest, but with the quiet, unmistakable arrival of a species the Compact had spent 3 centuries believing it had erased. The vessel that came through the dark was not what anyone expected. There was no dramatic entrance, no thunderous declaration, no armada darkening the sky in a show of overwhelming force. Instead, a single ship, larger than anything in the Compact's registry, but moving with a slow, deliberate patience that felt almost gentle, settled into a stable orbit and simply waited. For 3 days it did nothing but sit there, its presence a silent counterpoint to the chaos unfolding on the surface below. Compact sensor operators tracked every micrometer of its position, every fluctuation in its energy signature, desperate for some sign of hostile intent that never came. It did not power weapons. It did not launch fighters. It did not even attempt to communicate, as though it were waiting for something on the ground to resolve itself first. That something was the fate of Sergeant Alina Marsh. The traditionalist faction, backed into a corner and increasingly desperate, pushed for a final vote to have her executed before the ship above could act, arguing that a dead hostage removed whatever leverage the humans believed they held. The reformist faction countered that killing her now would guarantee the very catastrophe everyone feared, transforming a patient, watching presence into a justified one. It was Kiever, of all people, who ended up in the room when the vote was called. Not because of rank, not because of authority, but because Marsh herself had requested his presence, citing the Discoverer's clause buried deep in Compact protocol that guaranteed observation rights to whoever first identified a site of historical significance. Nobody had the political will to deny her the request in the middle of a crisis this large. He sat in the gallery and watched the council argue in circles for 6 straight hours, watched delegates who had spent their entire careers building consensus on trade routes and resource allocation suddenly grapple with a decision that could determine whether their entire civilization survived the week. He watched Archivist Saul, who had fought Marsh's credibility from the very first day, slowly go quiet as the weight of the argument shifted beneath her. When the vote finally came, it was close. Closer than anyone in the reformist faction had expected, closer than anyone in the traditionalist faction had wanted. But it landed, by the narrowest of margins, on the side of restraint. Marsh would not be executed. She would be permitted to communicate with the ship in orbit, under supervision, in an attempt to establish what the Compact's official statement carefully called a framework for peaceful resolution. What actually happened, when the channel finally opened, was considerably less formal than any framework. "This is Sergeant Alina Marsh, TFS Watchkeeper, requesting confirmation of receiving vessel," she said into the array the Compact's engineers had hastily assembled, her voice steady despite the dozens of officials crowded into the row. Loam behind her. The response took several seconds, long enough for the tension in the room to stretch taut. Then a voice came through, translated by systems that had, by now, had weeks to refine their grasp of a language extinct for 3 centuries. "Watchkeeper, this is the recovery vessel Providence. Sergeant Marsh, please confirm your status and the status of your vessel." "Alive," Marsh said. "Ship systems active and stable. I've been talking to the locals." There was a pause on the other end, and when the voice returned, it carried something that might have been dry amusement layered beneath its professional cadence. Understood. We picked up the activation signal 3 weeks ago. Command wants a full debrief once you're secure. How are the locals treating you? Marsh glanced sideways briefly at the room full of Threll officials watching her with a mixture of terror and fascination. Complicated, she said, but better than you'd expect, given the history books they were working from. The exchange that followed, stripped of its diplomatic weight, was almost mundane. Two soldiers checking in with each other after a very long, very strange assignment. But the Threll Council, listening through their own translation systems, understood exactly what they were witnessing. This was not the tense negotiation of two hostile powers feeling each other out for weakness. This was two people from the same civilization, separated by 3 centuries of silence, picking up a conversation as though no time had passed at all. It was, in its own quiet way, more unsettling than any threat could have been. Over the following days, as formal communication channels were established between the Compact's council and the vessel in orbit, a picture began to emerge that reframed everything the Compact thought it understood about the war it believed it had won. Humanity had not vanished. It had withdrawn deliberately and completely, sealing its remaining fleets and colonies behind layers of secrecy so thorough that even the Compact's most sophisticated intelligence networks had never detected so much as a whisper of their continued existence. Not out of weakness, and not out of fear, but out of a calculated decision, made at the highest levels of a command structure that no longer exists in the same form, that further engagement with a species locked into an existential war footing would only produce more of what had already cost both sides so much. The Watchkeeper had been left behind deliberately, buried beneath what would eventually become the Compact's throne world, as a single quiet observer. Not a weapon poised to strike, but a witness poised to report. A contingency built by people who understood that leaving entirely, with no eyes on the ground at all, would mean losing all context for whatever civilization eventually rose from the ashes of a war they'd chosen to walk away from. Sergeant Marsh had not been a prisoner of that assignment. She had volunteered for it, along with a small rotation of crew members who had taken turns in stasis over the centuries, monitoring the Compact's development from the shadows, watching a species build an empire on a founding myth that had never once been true, and waiting for the day someone finally dug deep enough to find them. Why not just leave a machine to watch? Archivist Saul asked during one of the formal exchanges, her voice carrying less hostility now and more genuine bewilderment. Why risk a living crew? The answer came not from Marsh, but from a voice aboard the Providence identifying itself as Fleet Liaison Officer Devon Castellan. Because machines report data, he said. They don't understand context. They don't know the difference between a civilization that's grown wiser and one that's simply grown more efficient at hiding its worst impulses. We needed someone who could actually judge what kind of neighbors you'd become, not just count your warships. And what, Saul asked carefully, was the judgment? There was a pause before Castellan answered, and when he did, his voice carried none of the triumphant weight the traditionalists had feared, and none of the dismissive contempt the reformists had half expected either. Mixed, he said honestly. You built an empire on a lie about us, which isn't exactly a promising start. But you've also spent 300 years mostly not conquering anyone who didn't threaten you first. You've maintained relatively stable governance without collapsing into the kind of internal purges that ended a dozen other civilizations we've observed. And when confronted with a truth that could have shattered your entire national identity, Your leadership chose, by however narrow a margin, not to execute the messenger. That's not nothing. The council chamber absorbed that assessment in silence. It was not the ringing endorsement some had hoped for. It was not the condemnation others had feared. It was, in its own careful way, an invitation to keep proving something, rather than a verdict already rendered. There was one night, in the second week after the Providence took orbit, when the entire crisis nearly ended in fire. A compact patrol wing, operating under standing defense orders that predated the discovery by decades, registered the human vessel's slow orbital adjustment as a possible attack vector. A routine correction that, to a jumpy sensor operator working a double shift, looked exactly like a warship repositioning for a strike run. Weapons batteries across 3 orbital defense platforms went hot within 90 seconds. Somewhere in a command bunker beneath the Capitol, a young officer with authorization codes he had never once expected to use stood over a console with his hand hovering above a firing key, waiting for a confirmation order that could have ended everything in a single catastrophic mistake. It was Marsh who stopped it, and she did it without ever leaving the medical wing she was still technically confined to. She had insisted, days earlier, on maintaining an open audio channel to the Providence at all times, a request the Council had granted more out of exhaustion than genuine trust. When the defense platforms went active, she heard the chatter on the compact's own emergency frequency a full 40 seconds before most of the Council did, patched through by a nervous young technician who hadn't yet learned to filter what she was allowed to hear. "Stand down," she said, and for the first time since her revival, there was something in her voice that wasn't patience. It was command, the flat, immediate authority of someone who had spent a career giving orders in the half-second before it was too late to matter. That ship is not adjusting for an attack run. It's compensating for your moon's gravitational drift. If you fire on it, you will not be firing on an empty gesture. You will be starting the exact war you spent 300 years being told you'd already won. The order to stand down came through with seconds to spare, relayed by a duty officer who would later admit, in a private debrief nobody was supposed to record, that his hands had been shaking too badly to type the authorization code on the first attempt. Nobody slept easily in the Capitol for the rest of that week. But something had shifted in the aftermath, a recognition, however grudging, that the human sergeant in the medical wing had just talked an entire defense network back from the edge of a mistake that could never have been undone. Archivist Saul, who had been in the command bunker when the order almost went out, found Keever the next morning in the excavation's makeshift archive room and said nothing for a long moment before finally speaking. "She could have let it happen," Saul said quietly. "Let us fire first, given her people every justification they'd ever need." She shook her head slowly, the ceremonial crest along her jaw drooping with something that looked almost like exhaustion. She didn't. The formal negotiations that followed took the better part of 2 months, conducted across a strange, evolving dynamic that neither side had a template for. The compact was not being asked to surrender, was not facing an ultimatum backed by overwhelming force. Humanity, it turned out, wanted remarkably little from the encounter beyond acknowledgement of the truth and a framework for future contact that didn't require another 3 centuries of hidden observation. But wanting little did not mean the process was simple. The traditionalist faction, humiliated by the unraveling of a myth that had underpinned their political power for generations, fought every concession with the desperate energy of people watching their entire worldview collapse in real time. Several attempted, in the final weeks, a last effort to seize control of the Watchkeeper's data core by force, hoping that destroying the evidence might somehow preserve the narrative they'd built their careers on. It did not go well for them. The ship, still fully operational and still very much aware of everything happening around it, simply sealed its own systems the moment the intrusion began, locking out every access attempt without so much as raising its weapons in response. It didn't need to. The message was clear enough without violence. The truth was no longer something that could be contained by force, because it no longer existed only inside a vault beneath a mountain. It existed in the transmitted logs, the recorded testimony, the growing body of correspondence between the Compact's reformist officials and a fleet liaison officer, who answered every hard question with the same unhurried patience Marsh herself had shown from the very first day. There was one revelation, buried in the final weeks of negotiation, that never made it into the Compact's public record at all, surfacing only decades later in a handful of academic papers nobody outside the Historical Review office ever bothered to read clo. Selly. The watchkeeper had not been alone. Fleet Liaison Officer Castellan confirmed it almost offhandedly, during a routine technical exchange about the ship's registry designation, in a tone that suggested he hadn't quite realized how much weight the admission would carry on the other end of the channel. The third rear observation fleet, he explained, had not consisted of a single vessel quietly left behind to watch one civilization. It had been an entire dispersed network. Dozens of ships scattered across dozens of worlds humanity had once fought, and then deliberately chosen to withdraw from, each one buried, sealed, and left waiting under the same quiet contingency that had kept the watchkeeper humming beneath the Compact's throne world for 300 years. Some of those other ships, Castellan admitted, had never been found. Some, in the centuries since, had likely been unearthed by civilizations that responded to the discovery very differently than the Threll Compact eventually had, with fear instead of curiosity, with violence instead of the narrow, hard-won restraint that had kept Marsh alive long enough to speak. Nobody aboard the Providence would say exactly what had happened at those other sites. The silence, when Saul pressed the question, was its own kind of answer. "How many?" Saul finally asked, her voice carrying none of its usual composure. "How many civilizations lived on top of one of your ships and never knew?" "More than you'd guess," Castellan said. "Fewer than you'd fear." It was, Keever thought, listening from the gallery, the closest thing to an honest answer anyone aboard the Providence had given the entire negotiation, an admission that the galaxy was larger, older, and considerably stranger than the Compact's founding myths had ever allowed it to imagine, and that the story unfolding beneath their own throne world was not unique. It was simply the one they happened to be standing inside of. That realization did more to shift the Council's final position than any single argument Marsh or Castellan had made in the weeks before it. A single buried warship could be dismissed, eventually, as an anomaly, an isolated relic of a war long since settled. An entire dispersed network of them, scattered across a galaxy the Compact had never fully mapped, waiting in patient silence beneath worlds that had no idea what slept beneath their own capitals, was something else entirely. It was proof that the story the Compact told about itself had never been the only story that mattered, and possibly never would be again. By the time the formal accord was signed, the political landscape of the Compact had shifted in ways nobody could have predicted 3 months earlier. Archivist Saul, who had begun the crisis as one of Marsh's fiercest interrogators, ended it as one of the negotiation's key architects, having come to understand, gradually, and without ever quite admitting it aloud, that preserving a comfortable lie was a poorer service to her people than confronting an uncomfortable truth. Delegate Corps, who had spent the entire crisis pushing for violence, quietly resigned his position in the weeks following the Accord's signing, unable to reconcile his political survival with a truth he had spent every waking hour trying to suppress. And Sergeant Alina Marsh, who had woken from 3 centuries of stasis with nothing but a single question on her lips, found herself, somewhat to her own visible bemusement, cast in the role of ambassador, not by any formal appointment, but simply because she was the one person both sides trusted to translate not just language, but intention. Kiever Thess, the survey technician who had almost talked himself out of reporting an anomaly under an ice moon nobody cared about, was granted a formal position within the Compact's newly established Office of Interspecies Historical Review, a bureaucratic title for what amounted to being one of a handful of people trusted to help rewrite 300 years of founding mythology without triggering a second collapse. It was, everyone involved agreed, an imperfect resolution to an impossible situation. The Compact did not emerge from the crisis unified or entirely at peace with itself. Pockets of traditionalist resistance persisted for years, clinging to the old story even as the evidence against it became impossible to ignore. Some worlds within the Compact accepted the new history with something close to relief, grateful to finally understand the shape of the moral weight they'd unknowingly been carrying. Others resented it bitterly, viewing the revelation not as an opportunity for growth, but as a humiliation imposed on them by a species that had, in their eyes, simply been playing a longer, more patient game of conquest than anyone had anticipated. Marsh, when asked about that resentment during one of the many formal sessions that followed the Accord, offered an answer that Kiever would remember for the rest of his life. You? Ray allowed to be angry about the lie, she said, addressing a room full of officials still visibly struggling with the shape of their new reality. You're allowed to grieve the story you thought you knew, but don't confuse the anger at being lied to with anger at us for telling the truth eventually. We didn't have to send anyone here at all. We could have stayed hidden forever and let you keep believing whatever helped you sleep at night. We chose not to, because a species that builds its entire identity on a lie is a species that eventually does something worse to someone else to protect that lie. We'd rather deal with the discomfort now than watch you repeat our mistakes on some other civilization a century from now. There was a quieter moment in the last week before the Accord's final signing that Kiever never included in any official report, though he thought about it often in the years that followed. He had gone down to the hangar alone, using access credentials nobody had bothered to revoke, simply to stand in front of the watchkeeper one final time before the political machinery of 2 civilizations finally decided its fate. Marsh found him there an hour later, her escort waiting politely outside the blast doors at her own quiet insistence. You keep coming back down here, she said, settling against a support strut beside him, looking up at the same hull markings that had first stolen his breath months earlier. I keep trying to understand it, Kiever admitted. 300 years, one ship, one crew rotating through stasis pods generation after generation just to watch us and never say anything. He shook his head slowly. I don't know how you do that. I don't know how anyone does that. Marsh was quiet for a long moment, studying the ship the same way she had studied every room, every face, every impossible new fact since the moment she'd opened her eyes. You don't do it by thinking about 300 years, she said finally. Nobody could carry that weight all at once. You do it one rotation at a time, one watch. Then the next person takes over, and they do the same thing, and eventually it adds up to 3 centuries without any single person ever having to hold the whole thing alone. She looked at him. That's the only way anything worth doing ever gets done, Kiever. Not by one person carrying everything, by people trusting the next person in line to carry it after them. He thought about that for a long time after she'd gone, standing alone in the hangar one last time, listening to the low, patient hum of a ship that had never once stopped keeping its promise. The watchkeeper remained in its hangar beneath the throne world for another 6 months after the accord was signed, its crew rotation finally standing down after 3 centuries of continuous, silent vigilance. When it finally departed, escorted, at the Compact's own insistence, by a small honor formation of Threll vessels, the send-off was unlike anything the capital had ever staged before. There were no parades, no triumphant declarations, no attempt to spin the departure into some kind of victory narrative for either side. Instead, the crowds that gathered along the coastline near the excavation site stood largely in silence, watching a ship that had waited beneath their homes for 300 years finally rise into a sky it had never once seen since being sealed away. Sergeant Marsh stood on the observation deck of the Providence as the watchkeeper lifted free of the ice moon's gravity for the first time in 3 centuries, watching the throne world recede below her through a viewport that had, until recently, only ever shown her the inside of a stasis pod's readouts. Was it worth it? Kiever asked her over an open channel, one of the last conversations they would have before the fleet departed the system entirely. He had petitioned, against considerable bureaucratic resistance, for the chance to say a proper goodbye. Marsh was quiet for a long moment. The kind of quiet Kiever had learned, over the preceding months, meant she was actually considering the question rather than simply deflecting it. "Ask me in 100 years," she said finally, echoing something she'd apparently said once before long ago to someone else entirely. "Right now, all I know is that a promise got kept. That matters more than whether it was worth it." The watchkeeper's beacon, silent for 300 years, activated one final time as the ship prepared to leave orbit. Not the restricted IFF signal it had carried during its long vigil, but an open, formal transmission broadcast across every frequency the Compact's networks could carry. TFS Watchkeeper, 3rd Rear Observation Fleet, long watch concluded, the promise was kept. Kiever watched the ship vanish into the dark from the observation platform on the moon where it had spent 300 years waiting, feeling the particular ache of an ending that was also, somehow, unmistakably a begin. Ning, the Compact he had grown up in, no longer existed in quite the same form it had 3 months earlier. Its founding myth was gone, replaced by something messier and truer and considerably harder to build monuments to. But standing there in the cold, watching the last trace of engine light fade into the stars, he found he didn't mourn the loss nearly as much as he'd expected to. Some lines, he'd learned, were worth holding even when nobody was watching. And some promises once made were worth keeping even 300 years later, buried beneath ice, waiting patiently in the dark for someone curious enough and stubborn enough to finally come looking. Years later, when the Office of Interspecies Historical Review finally finished its long, painstaking work of rewriting the Compact's founding history for the classrooms of 100 worlds, Kiever Thess was asked, more times than he could count, to describe what it had actually felt like standing in that hangar the first time the floodlights caught the watchkeeper's hull. He never quite managed to put it into words the way the interviewers wanted. He always ended up talking instead about the silence, the particular, patient quality of a silence that had lasted 300 years without ever once breaking, without ever once giving up, without ever once forgetting what it was there to do. He kept on his desk in the small archive office the compact eventually granted him, a single object recovered from the excavation before the watchkeeper departed for good. A scrap of hull plating, no larger than his palm, stamped faintly with the edge of that same eagle emblem that had stopped his breath the first time he'd seen it. It wasn't valuable. It wasn't classified. Nobody in the new administration had ever asked for it back. He kept it anyway, because it reminded him of the one lesson the entire excavation had eventually taught him. The lesson that no monument, no founding myth, no comfortable story a civilization tells itself could ever quite replace. Somewhere out past the edge of everything the compact thought it understood about its own history. A species it had been taught to fear as extinct had spent 3 centuries proving, patiently, and without a single shot fired, that the truest kind of strength was never the kind that needed to announce itself. It simply had to be willing to wait, to hold the line however long the silence lasted, until the day someone finally came looking, and to still be standing there, steady and unbroken when they did.